had a massive life-changing accident in a light aircraft, which almost cost me my life. I was 63% third and fourth degree burns. Burns where you can be left with exposed bone. Get clearance to take off. I acknowledge that, and then I go full throttle. I'm now climbing and ascending towards the altitude point that I needed to reach. I reach between 1,000 and 1,200 feet. So I looked out my left-hand canopy window and I did a double take. I'd noticed a thin streak of visible yellow-orange flame. The fire that I'd noticed externally immediately breached the cockpit. I was watching altimeter spin down 1,000 feet and then dropping. When I got to 500 feet, the fire was now about halfway up within the small chamber of the cockpit. I opened my left-hand canopy door and it wouldn't open. I was like Jack Rabbit, quick as a flash. I was now clambered up onto the seat that I was sat in. I'd made a step over the small door lip between the seat and the left wing, composed myself on the wing, got my balance, snapped my hands above my head in prayer position, looked directly at the horizon in front of me, did not look down, and then I just went for it.
Before you start this episode, please can you click subscribe below and follow our social handles in the description. It's a massive help and it keeps you up to date with all the exciting announcements from the podcast. Well, Jamie, thank you very much for coming to see us today.
Yeah,
really appreciate you coming in.
Yeah, good to be here, yeah.
So we start every chat with people that come on in the same way. So I'm going to throw you a challenge to start. So hopefully you're up for that. I'm sure you are. So you've got a minute just to go and tell us all about yourself from, Jamie in the early days all the way up to present day. And you only got a minute. So hopefully that focuses your attention to go and hit the pertinent points.
That is a challenge with my life especially.
I did think that.
Okay, I'll do my best. So born in Luton and Dunstable Hospital, Luton for my sins. Don't hold it against me. Luton gets a bit of a bad rap, but I've got pretty good memories of growing up in Stopsley, just on the outskirts of Luton. My grandparents lived there as well. They were a big inspiration to me in my younger years. Moved across to Leighton Buzzard in Bedfordshire, went to school there, right through to high school. Had a bit of a couple of wayward years in my sort of teenage years, and I was a bit of a I was up to no good. I was kind of rebelling against the system, if you will. I remember getting arrested a couple of times, but that's another story. And I was a bit of a low key sort of crim. Probably thought I was a bit of a master crim, but it was all pretty low key, seemingly benign.
Yeah.
But it was a track that I nearly sort of followed, if you will. But luckily, I managed to pull back from that and turn it around, as it were. Started to pay attention in school, did pretty well eventually, and got sort of relative jobs, not until after I'd travelled around the world as a young backpacker. So I'd literally gone all the way around the world, worked in Southern Africa, worked in Australia briefly, then moving on. My first career was actually with Thames Valley Police as a young officer. So following my dream, doing that work, chasing life on the 999s, 24/7, kind of like trying to put a band-aid on everything, so to speak. I then took a sabbatical some years later, went to university quite late on in life, sort of mid-20s, after doing some more round-the-world work as a diver and as an instructor in various locations, including some remote expedition work. So following the sabbatical, I went on to university in Norwich, University of East Anglia, joined the army as well with Cambridge University Officer Training Corps, went on. I did selection for the Parachute Regiment, went through Royal Military Academy Sandhurst, then did selection for UK Special Forces, served with a squadron part of UKSF as an SAS reservist for a number of years, then had an ambition to fly, got bitten, as it were. Had a massive life-changing accident in a light aircraft at the tender age of 32, which almost cost me my life, and I crawled back from the brink of that one, and with a great deal of medical support and interventions, eventually was able to pull out of that long dark tunnel of being a large third degree, if you will, burns victim. Skin of my teeth job really coming back. But the truth is, I crawled back, but was able to eventually keep up the good fight and make a newfound success of what I call now version 2.0 of Jamie Hull. I've done a lot of extraordinary things since, a load of highlights that I can perhaps elaborate on as part of the chat. But then moreover, recently I got published, my story got published with Penguin, and I was very fortunate to get picked up with that. Life on a Thread is the book, and it's been doing very well. And here I am.
There we go, sitting in our studio.
Yeah. So, it's been a long, protracted, extraordinary life journey with a lot of twists and turns. But hopefully I'm here now to make a difference and share my story with others and give people a bit of inspiration out there.
Brilliant. No, yeah, thanks for the summary, Joe. It's really interesting, and there's tons of stuff that I want to dig into, absolutely. So going back to some of your early years then. So you said you were a bit of a Jack the Lad, to put it bluntly. So take me back to sort of early Jamie. What was that all about?
Well, as I mentioned, I grew up in Leighton Buzzard in Bedfordshire, and it's for those of you that may know, if you've got knowledge, it's a relatively sleepy little market town.
Not too far away from here.
It's not too far away from sort of Northampton, kind of area where we're at now. Don't get me wrong. I mean, the town was kind of a good place to grow up. I've got good memories. This was pre-internet. This was pre-mobile phone. I've got great memories of like cutting it around, cruising about on my little BMX bike, from a young age. But I guess I was young, independent, very independent. I was strong-minded, strong-willed. But growing up, sadly, as happens, my parents took a separation. They just weren't getting on.
Yeah.
There was a lot of arguing and to and fro in that department, and eventually they decided to separate. That's not uncommon. It's not necessarily a sob story. But what happened was I stayed in the town for the sake of continuity with high school, if you will, and my mates, my peers, and that continuity of education. I thought it was perhaps wise to stay. So rather than I had the option to sort of move away with my mum at the time, but I chose to actually stay with my father, and for no other reason than, like I mentioned, that continuity.
Yeah.
And when I stayed, the problem being is that actually one of the downsides was that my father did work away quite a lot because he kind of had to. That was his job. He was doing what he was doing. And that left me to my own devices as a youngster.
Yeah.
So I was kind of up to no good.
It's good and bad, isn't it?
Yeah. Too much time on my hands. So I'm like as I mentioned, I'm sort of cutting around on my bike, thinking that I was kind of lord of the manor, sort of, a bit of a young sort of gangster in the town, getting up to no good. And literally it just kind of progressed. So from real petty crime, like a little bit of sort of basic shoplifting here and there, I ended up sort of scrambling on the top of the roofs in the town centre and prizing up, the odd tile here and there, and kind of a bit of, low level sort of breaking and entering type stuff, prize up a bit of tile work or a bit of, felt in the roof and poke my head in and have a look. And that kind of just escalated. Yeah. So I literally was sort of starting to go down a slippery slope. And if I wasn't careful, I probably would have taken quite a dark tumble in life. And I mean, I had people that I knew, peers at the time, peers from the sort of peer group, the friend group at the time, that literally did go on. And one guy ended up getting potted for an armed robbery. Wow. I learned years later. Another guy got quite heavily involved in drugs, and he was dealing. He ended up going down for that. And then there was another guy I knew that kind of got heavily involved in the drugs, the narcotics, and he was actually using, and he ended up sort of messing himself up quite badly, with the health and the kind of general well-being. And he was the shadow of the man that I knew in the early years, when I'd sort of bumped into him randomly later on in life. Yeah. So it's just trivial examples of the dangers of what can happen in youth.
Do you think that could have been you?
It could have been me. And I mean, I was going down a slippery slope like I mentioned, and luckily, shall we say, about the age of 15, 16, I managed to turn it around after being like 2 years the hoodlum. Yeah. And literally getting up to all sorts of things. A couple of examples, but I actually did get arrested by Old Bill at the time for two things. So one was a shoplifting offence, and I think the one that I got caught for, and probably there was 999 offences, trust me, similarly, that I didn't get caught for. Yeah. But one that I did get sort of picked up for was, and rightfully so, I needed to be caught, was a trivial, shoplifting some sweets and I think a can of drink out of the local newsagent, and someone spotted me, and that was it. I got collared, and then the police, etc. And then there was another incident where I ended up throwing some stones or some pebbles at some greenhouses.
Yeah.
Locally, it was like commercial greenhouses that were growing
big ones,
plants, tomatoes, flowers.
Yeah.
And I'm throwing these pebbles, thinking, yeah, this is good fun. But what I couldn't hear was the panes of glass shattering, because the local traffic on the adjacent road was pretty much drowning out the contact with pebbles versus glass.
Yeah.
So there's me thinking, well, this is good fun. I'm throwing stones and nothing is seemingly happening here. But little did I realise that I broke about 99 windows.
Wow.
The next day, I went back to do exactly the same thing. I think it was summer holidays. I was probably bored, delinquent, up to no good. And then as I threw the first pebble, or the first stone rather, all of a sudden, let's just say a dozen mature men popped their heads up from behind the hedge, as if to say, there he is.
Yeah.
Let's get him, kind of thing. Anyway, people came round, they came sort of running after me. I ended up sort of running into some local woodland, but I think one of the gentlemen recognised where I lived.
Yeah.
A call was made, a call was put in. The following morning, there I was in my parents' home, consuming cornflakes, and all of a sudden I sort of looked and looked again. I saw this big tall hat walking down the driveway, the big Bobby's helmet.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, like, swallow hard, eating my cornflakes at the time, oh shit, he must be coming for me. Sure enough, on the door, and it was PC Plod, asked for me by name.
Yeah.
My mother called me and sort of collared me and brought me to the front door, and I'm sort of like ashen in front of this copper, thinking, oh shit, I'm in trouble now. And sure enough, he said, is your name Jamie Hull? Yeah. He said, you better come with me. He carted me off to the local cop shop. Yeah. And that was it. I had to go through the question. I ended up getting cautioned yet again. So I got 2 cautions as a young teenager. I remember for the shoplifting and for the criminal damage, as it were.
So what made
and that was a wake-up call.
Yeah. What made, so on that then, what made you sort of, so later on in your life, you've gone down that Thames Valley route, a military route. So what do you think was the stop change for you from going from doing those things to opting for wanting to do that as a career?
I think...
I'm guessing it wasn't that you liked the hat.
No, I think when I managed to turn it around, there was a couple of things that turned it around. It was the fact that I probably got arrested a couple of times, and obviously all the sheer bollockings from everybody surrounding me, parents, if you like, good peers that were sort of mentoring me, people like the teachers in school, the head teacher that took me aside and had a good old stern word with me on those occasions thereafter. But it was also down to me to realise, look, hang about, I'm being a prize prick here, for want of a better kind of description. And if I don't sort this out, then, nobody's probably going to do it for me, and I'm going to probably slip down that slope. And then I remember getting the envelope GCSEs. I looked at it and I thought, this is terrible. I think I got 1 GCSE grade, and my grandfather, I think at the time, had a good stern word with me and said, look, you can toe the party line here and play the game of life and start working, start focusing, or you can carry on being an idiot, basically. Yeah. And look where that's getting you. I mean, look at the envelope. There's proof of the pudding, kind of thing. Yeah. So he had that strong word in my ear, and luckily it was the time when I still was receptive to my peers, to my elders, and I knew to play the game, and I knew to turn it around. Yeah. If I didn't, I was going to be in a world of trouble. So that's what happened. And then I guess from roughly speaking about 16, I kind of started working in school and doing better. Yeah. And kind of getting better grades, and eventually, as I mentioned, I took the high road. I chose to take the high road, and that wasn't necessarily easier, because in essence, it's easier to take the low road.
Of course,
it's easier to arse around,
things, isn't it? Yeah.
And be that kid in the back of the classroom, kind of messing around and not listening to the teacher, and basically play fighting with your sort of ne'er-do-well peers in the back of the class. But I eventually thought wisely, and I guess I perhaps moved from one demographic, one camp within the school, and started perhaps not knocking about with those particular peers, and moved to perhaps a different peer group that were a bit more attentive, shall we say, perhaps a bit more sporty. I was interested in school sports as well, so that was what kind of steered me away. A bit of football, rugby, athletic, perhaps a bit of cricket in the summertime, but I was a crap batsman.
Yeah.
And eventually, you know, with all of that change going on, a lot of that was down to me, but a lot of it was down to the better influence that I would sort of lean towards. And over time, I just did better. And that was what it was all about, really, with my early sort of testimony.
Sometimes with early years, it's I think you either. I mean, my daughter's 17 in November, my son's 9 in October. Make sure I get those right. Bad with dates usually. And yeah, I think you do change a lot. You know, the person that she was in 13, 14, 15 to where she is now, it's a different person, bit more mature. In certain situations, just a bit more experienced, and hopefully the good points of the people that she meets during her life, whether that be me and her mum or the teachers or whatever, can rub off, and she can then do with that information what she needs to do, and hopefully, you know, use it to be a better version of herself, I suppose. But did you know at that point that you wanted to go into like a police type or military type future?
No, absolutely not. I mean, you know, let's face it, in the early years, I was a bit anti-establishment.
Yeah.
I would do everything to run and hide and dodge and weave from, you know, the police if I could get away with it. But that was, you know, these were fairly, in my mind, it didn't seem that I was doing wrong necessarily. These were like benign years.
Yeah.
In my sort of development, in my younger youth, and you don't necessarily realise that you're on a wrong track.
Yeah.
It's perhaps not until more serious things start to occur and escalate. And like I mentioned, the examples of getting arrested a couple of times, they were wake-up calls, admittedly. But it could have progressed if I'd have perhaps chosen to follow that track. And these are absolutely, they're crucial years for young people's development. And it's crucial that not only the individuals, but the peers around you, parents, perhaps school members, perhaps coaches in life can help to steer young people.
I think there's enough steering for young people these days.
I think it's hard, and I don't think, especially adults now, have so much, let's just say distraction in life. There is so much going on in the average adult's life, with work, with career, with commitments, with obligations, and family is just something that they're trying to almost drag along by the side, as a sort of an adjacent focus, irrespective of everything else that they're trying to juggle in life. This is the problem. There's so much now that the average adult or average family unit is trying to juggle. Yeah. It's not like the old days. I mean, now with the advent of internet, we are overwhelmed with sort of business and what we've got to take care of, and it's like it can be overwhelming. So kids, I don't think, get the same degree of nurturing and supervision that they perhaps got in days of old. That's my take on it, at least. And it's really up to, I do believe it's up to parents, and I do believe it's up to schools especially to realise the investment that kids desperately need to keep them on the right track and to steer them implicitly. It's not just about the education. It's not just about feeding them a curriculum towards GCSE. There's more that needs to be done, ideally, to keep kids on the right track in order that they kind of get there. And I would say, what is the definition of there? I would argue that that's probably about 18, 19 years of age. If you can focus on those perhaps crucial 5 years, perhaps from between about 13 to 18, and 18, 19, by then, if everybody's done the right job on that said child, in terms of helping to coach that development, there's a very good chance that young person is going to get there. Yeah. And then they can perhaps take over, because they'll have everything, the tools in their arsenal to be able to cope with the rigours of life and realise, actually, I need to be this kind of person and I need to keep doing my best.
I think there's a lot of pressure on young people when you say about getting there. I think there's a lot of pressures on youngsters to get there, wherever there is, quickly, and to define what there is very, very quickly in their life. When I think about my experiences and when I really started to focus in my life, probably was in my mid-20s. Yeah. I was focused. I was around what I was doing at the time. But when I think about where I really, really started to get it, whatever get it means, but get serious, get it, and think, that is what I want to be doing. And kids having to make decisions on what their next steps are at 16, 17, maybe even earlier sometimes. And I know my daughter definitely struggled with kind of what route to go, really know what route to go down. And I thought when she gets to that age, I'll be very much, you need to know what you need to do. And actually, I was completely opposite. I was quite surprised. Do what you want to enjoy. Do what you want to enjoy. You need to learn. You need to develop things. And I think that curriculum's one thing. I think depending on what you want to do, if you need those sort of subjects and qualifications, and you need that exposure to grades on maths, English, etc., science, that's one thing. But for me, I didn't get great grades. I left school relatively early. It was about experience for me, and I learnt a lot more through experience and people skills, conversations, doing things rather than learning things. Not everybody's the same, and it depends where you want to go with your life. But she still doesn't know what she wants to do. And I think a lot of youngsters they see social media, they see some of their peers, their friends, they've got it all figured out. 17, they've got it all figured out. And I try and say to Faith, most of your friends probably don't. That's the standard they have to live up to, because that's what social media and society say is the right thing to do. You're 17, you've got to know where you want to go with your life. You need to want to do that. You want to go and do this. You need to want to become this. I didn't know any of that until probably mid to late 20s. I'm 34 now. I look older, but I'm 34 now. But I didn't know until that point. And I look back and I think, well, actually, why would I put pressure on her to know exactly where she wants to go? Unless she really was passionate about wanting to be a policeman or policewoman or work in law or whatever it was. I don't know where she's going to go yet, but what I think is important is that she experiences situations, has as much interaction with people as possible, because I think that's the biggest source of learning is people, experiences, conversations like we're having today. And I just think there's far too much of a push and an urgency for a 16, 17-year-old or someone of that age to know exactly what they want to do in life. It's just impossible.
Agree. I mean, I think...
how can you aspire to get there? Yeah. It's just impossible.
I think far too much emphasis on sort of the classical... sort of educational routes with GCSE, A-level, potentially university.
Yeah.
And, more emphasis also needs to be placed on individuals to develop sort of softer skills within themselves.
Agreed, yeah.
And so that they can become just better adults and stronger adults with better coping mechanisms. And perhaps emphasis should be on, that they should perhaps volunteer. They should do a bit of voluntary kind of work something within the community, something just to help out for a little while. It doesn't need to be for long periods, but it could be, that they get a stint of volunteering in a care home, just for a fortnight or something, just so that they can understand, what it's like to be elderly and what they need to go through and the kind of care that needs to be undertaken. Or perhaps they do a bit of voluntary work in the sort of work sector, whatever that might be, because voluntary work could be a bit of a wake-up call for them and actually make them realise, this is what I kind of like. I maybe aspire to that, or actually these are the things that definitely don't interest me. I don't like, but I've had exposure to them. I appreciate what these people do. It's just not for me. But, there's not necessarily a whole emphasis on, let's just say, extracurricular type activity for the mainstream. Kids, students kind of going through the motions growing up. A lot of it seems to be geared towards classical education, and I don't think that's necessarily entirely right. But it's other things as well that can steer them in the right direction. It's kind of perhaps being members of sports groups and clubs and societies. Questionably, arguably, do we have enough of that? Do we have enough options on the table for young people? What about youth clubs? When we were youngsters, youth clubs perhaps were more readily available, more prevalent. There was scouts groups, there was organisations, there was youth clubs. Is all that still going on? Is it still available? I think a lot of that's kind of fallen by the wayside. It's not so prevalent out there.
I think a lot of kids as well, with like internet and social media, would rather go and sit on that and scroll around all day than go to a club.
I mean, now kids, a lot of them are losing social skills. They're almost losing, or they're not even necessarily developing the art of having a conversation.
Yeah, and that's core, really.
And that's a real shame. I mean, you see it. You travel on public transport now, and everyone's like that, glued to their phone, clicking away on tablets, mobile phones. People don't talk to each other so much anymore, and if you will, that seems trivial, but I think it's probably a problem in society because we're becoming more insular and self-centered as a result. And perhaps we don't have so much external focus or necessarily that desire or that inclination or will to want to extend our kind of periphery, that vision, and focus on others, and perhaps want to associate, help, socialise with others.
Yeah.
So you might have your small clique, but that's somewhat limited, I think. And social media is definitely a cause of that.
I think there's so many positives that it can bring, and I think, but so many negatives it can bring as well. It's one of those. Yeah, we could debate social media and the internet for forever and a day, and we wouldn't be any further forward. Would we?
One thing the internet that I will say though, there are pros and absolute advantages definitely, but it has put a lot of pressure on people fundamentally, because it's kind of like an instantaneous world now because of the internet. People expect business to be done sort of bang bang bang, on the fly, on the nose, and it puts a lot of pressure on people. People get a lot of perhaps requests and demands via the internet, whether it's email, social media, and that in itself can put a lot of pressure on people. That's the only thing I would like to say.
Yeah, no, I don't disagree with you. So, going on from your kind of early years, then, how did you have you always had a passion for aviation?
Yes, in a way. One of my very early memories is that growing up initially in sort of Stopsley and then moving across the other side of Bedfordshire, like I mentioned, was that I was always visiting. My grandparents lived in Stopsley at the time, and my grandfather was a real aviation nut. He trained as a pilot in his younger years. He kind of went on to work for the former English Electric, which became BAE, so British Aerospace Engineering. He used to take me to Luton Airport. So I remember myself and my younger brother with the broken half of a binocular each.
Yeah.
And we're looking through this half a binocular each, so a monocle, if you will.
Yeah.
And my grandfather had like the Gucci new pair, but we're looking through the fence line at the boundary of Luton Airport, and I'm watching all the sort of commercial air traffic on the runway, sort of on the threshold points, and pilots were clearly busying themselves, throttling up the engine. Got the noise of the backwash of the jets. This was the old Monarch jets, typically flying out of Luton Airport, and then the down, the sort of downwind stream of the smell, that kerosene fumes from the airport, from the aircraft on the hard standing there. So that if you like, that backwash of noise and fumes was like filling my ears and nostrils.
Yeah.
And you picture that scene. That's quite an inspiration for a young kid who's being subjected to this, like watching, observing, and then the big aircraft, because I'm looking at it through the magnification of the broken binocular. Yeah. And that was it. I was kind of like hooked.
Yeah.
And I was fascinated by these big aircraft. And then, other memories, sitting on my grandfather's knee, and he'd be talking to me about aircraft and aviation and all things to do with like sort of aeronautical and the space, the space industry. I was fascinated by that. So there was always a seed for me, and I would always be wanting to read about space travel and the astronauts and the stories of the early astronauts, and this is kind of where it all came from, really. And I always figured that perhaps one day when I'm older, if I got the opportunity, I'd love to learn to fly. But my career took a slightly, if you like, a very different turn, because my sort of first career was with Thames Valley Police as a young officer, like I mentioned. But later on, I figured there was an opportunity, and I did take that up some years later on.
So how did that opportunity sort of manifest itself?
So initially, I was in the army, and I had a role with UK Special Forces for a number of years, and I was kind of doing my thing, kind of going around the world, working in different environments, and so on and so forth. And I always figured in the back of my mind, actually, the flying was something that I wanted to sort of test the water on, and I wanted to actually do. Not just to talk the talk, but to walk the walk. So the first step for me was to get a visa in order to go where I wanted to go.
Yeah.
I chose to go to Florida because of a chance of better weather or meteorological conditions.
Is that to learn to fly?
To learn to fly, yeah. And I chose Florida specifically because of the better chance of good weather windows in the training. So it was the summer of 2007. So I got my visa from the US Embassy in London, and that in itself was a bit of a feat, just persuading the authorities there that I wasn't a risk, that I wasn't a threat. Because remember, this was post 9/11.
Yeah.
And obviously what had happened.
Yeah.
And now the Americans were very tetchy.
They would have been nervous, yeah.
Of course. And they didn't just give the visas away, particularly for individuals that wanted to fly, foreign visitors within the US airspace.
Yeah.
They did not just give those visas away. So I had to go through a round of interviews at the US Embassy in order to persuade them that I was, if you will, an innocent and sort of
Credible.
safe bet.
Yeah.
So I got the visa eventually, and armed with that, I went off to the States, and I embarked or started a comprehensive flying training program in an area in a region of Florida. And then I'm going to basically fast forward 1 month because it was a long story, and I was there training in earnest with US flight instructors for that 1 month period. And eventually I went solo, so I went what they call pilot in command. And I'm doing the business because I'm certified and qualified to fly for solo. I'd been solo for about 8 days, and on this one particular day, which was the 19th of August 2007, so for the record and from my recollection, I'd been up in the morning, and then what happens is typically I'd made that first flight, everything was fine, and I'd come back down again, and I'd come back into the flight training sort of centre, and it was time to have a break. You know, a couple of hours elapses, you have a bit of lunch, sort of recharge the battery, so to speak, just generally have a bit of a rest, you know, maybe jump on the computer, have a look at the air traffic information services, have a look at the radar for the local weather. And also what happens, the reason why you might take a chunk of downtime in the middle of the day in Florida is because the rain and storm fronts can sweep through.
Okay.
And that's quite typical during the hotter part of the day and the midday hours. Often the clouds and the precipitation builds up.
Yeah.
And then it just dumps.
Yeah.
And the winds gently will sweep it through, and it's
better
gone.
in the morning and late
Typically,
afternoon.
earlier in the day and perhaps beyond in the afternoon are good bets. So they're good sort of clear weather windows, and that's precisely typically the sort of pattern that was emerging. And if you will, that the trend and the rhythm that I was flying and on the timings and doing that.
Yeah.
So on this afternoon, 19th of August 2007, I got my window to fly again. I got my clearance from the flight training centre that I was working with, and I did the weather checks. I went out, did my sort of walk rounds, did all the checks on the aircraft. Everything was good. Everything was normal. So typically, what am I looking at? I'm looking at the quick fuel sample from a little valve on the underside of the aircraft, making sure that the contaminants were free from that little fuel sample. So I'd hold it up to the light, looking at the low lead blue, no fuel contaminants, it's all clear. Just toss it on the asphalt, because that's what I was told to do. It would evaporate instantly because of the heat, just to kind of give you another indicator of what the environment was like out there. It was so hot, and stinking hot and humid, because it was Florida in the high summer. This was in August. And then I would do my other checks, so just make sure that the aircraft control services were smooth and operational. So you'd sort of move the rudder, you'd sort of move the ailerons up and down, and the various kind of control services, making sure it was all good and airworthy. Have a look at the prop again, make sure it's smooth, good condition. Jump into the aircraft itself next, follow the pre-flight sort of checks. So I had a wallet that was strapped to my right leg with a Velcro sort of strapping and a sort of Perspex plastic window that I could see the checkpoints. Go through all of those systematically and run through all my pre-flight checks. Everything was good. Fire up the engine and do the sort of brief sort of engine checks, check magnetos, check everything. And then eventually I'm speaking to air traffic control, and I get clearance to taxi out towards the sort of pre-threshold point, if you will. I can do further engine checks. So I push up my throttle. I get to a certain RPM on the indicator and make sure that the engine is good and it's strong. And I know that that engine is good to go, and that's going to get me up there. And then finally, with a few more sort of pre-flight checks at that stage, I get clearance to taxi out to the threshold point. Finally, I'm on that sort of that final threshold point for the runway. Get clearance to take off. I acknowledge that, and then I go full throttle. And I'm driving down the centre line. It's sort of a, if you will, kind of intermittent white line down the centre line. I'm aiming to get to 55 knots, pull back gently on the flight control stick between my knees and pull back gently, and then full throttle. So on the right hand is on the centre column, push that throttle all the way.
Yeah.
And as I lift, I can feel literally the wind underneath the wing, and it's lifting me up, and it's literally generating that lift that I need. And I'm now climbing and ascending towards, the altitude point that I needed to reach as par for the flight. I reach an indicated height above ground, or an altitude of between 1,000 and 1,200 feet indicated. And I know to hit that point above ground because that was, if you like, my window of kind of altitude is what we call the pattern.
Yeah.
So when I speak about the pattern, if you picture perhaps a rectangular shape within the sky, within the local airspace, typically above an aerodrome or a small municipal airport within that region. And that was what I was doing, taking off from the small aerodrome, heading up into the airspace, and then once I've hit the pattern, I can start working around within that pattern of the airspace.
Yeah.
And on this day, I'm making a few patterns, literally a few sort of rotations in the pattern, and I come downwind on this particular day, on this particular moment, and I did a double take. So I looked out my left-hand canopy window as I'm coming downwind, and initially everything was fine. And I make a point of giving my position down below. So finger on the pressure switch on top of the control stick between my legs. Press that pressure switch, speak to the tower down below, and give them my location in the air. So I basically tell them that I'm downwind, overhead downwind, and they acknowledge. And then I make a left-hand turn into wind. As I made my turn, like literally, I'd noticed a thin streak of visible yellow-orange flame out my left-hand canopy window. So I looked and looked again, thinking, is that what I think it is? And indeed, it was flame, and it was originating or coming from the front portion of the fuselage. And no sooner as I made that sort of left banking turn now, crosswind, and then again for a final left banking turn within the pattern, remember, now into wind.
Yeah.
And this would be my final approach towards the active runway, still some distance away, but down below in the distance, that final runway approach. So I'm on sort of final turn now. As I made that final turn, the fire that I'd noticed externally immediately breached the cockpit down below. So I look down at my feet operating on the rudder pedals, and I see flame building up around my feet and ankles.
Wow.
And I'm thinking, geez, I've got to get this aircraft down. And initially my mind started to panic and fluster at what was going on. The fire's building up, it's lapping around my boots and my socks. The problem is I'm only wearing shorts to the knee in that small two-seater cockpit in the left-hand seat. I remember I'm solo, so I've got no one else there. I'm in the left-hand seat. Fire's starting to build up, and I'm thinking on my feet, and I'm thinking rapidly about the situation, about what's going on. Oh my God, I've got to get this aircraft down. And I'm sort of trying to process it and trying to think about what's going on. And I'm admittedly, initially, quite flustered about the situation. I was watching altimeter spin down, if you will, from 1,000 feet and then dropping, and it's winding down through sort of 700, 600. When I got to 500 feet, approximately, indicated on altimeter in front of me, the fire was now about halfway up within the small chamber of the cockpit, meaning it was about belly height. And I knew that I was in a very grave and potentially very dangerous position at that stage. I was acutely aware of, obviously, the danger that fire posed. Interestingly, I couldn't really feel it too much on my body because perhaps the fact that the air ducts were open, a bit like the air ducts you get on the dashboard of your car.
Yeah.
So the air is getting through flow within the cockpit. And believe it or not, there's quite a lot of airflow. I mean, you need it in Florida because of the heat that you're working in out there in the environment. So good, solid airflow. It was kind of keeping me somewhat cool. And I couldn't necessarily feel the flames at that stage. but I could see them. It was like all around me, like I said, to belly height. But it was obviously clearly a very dangerous situation, and I was worried about that progressing further, and indeed that was what was happening. So at 500 feet, I actually came up with, call it a light bulb moment, and I decided that I wasn't going to go for runway in the conventional sense, that I was actually going to veer away gently to my left, aiming now for a grassy kind of expanse to the left of runway in the distance. And I could see it quite clearly. Good, clear, grassy stretch left and right of runway, but I was heading for the left-hand side. Because it seemed like the sort of the larger expanse and the clearer option. And as I'm gliding in, literally, I followed the emergency protocol. So it was exactly what I'd been taught. I'd practiced it in the sort of dry sense, in dry runs with various instructors again and again. So I simply followed the emergency drill or the protocol. I turned the key to the ignition off, the red switches, Alpha and Bravo, magnetos off, master switch off, lights off, strobes off. In the center column, I flicked the fuel pump to the off position, rotate the fuel selector valve off. Everything.
And you're doing all of this whilst there's flames at belly height.
Yeah, but it's a simple emergency protocol that I'd been taught. And in hindsight, in retrospect, when I look back, I can remember and recall one of the US instructors said to me, and I quote, he said, above all, if you've got an emergency and there's a problem, fly the damned aircraft. And these words, if you will, and I've thought about this many times, these words at the time, they echoed and they reverberated, if you will, in my memory. And remember, it's all coming on top. This was a genuine life-threatening situation. But my mind flicked back simply to the training, and I thought, I've got to follow the drill. And that, if you will, that helped me to subside in my mind the heat of the moment, so to speak, and the panic that I kind of acknowledged in myself initially, the fluster that was going on here initially. And by following the drill, by following the protocol, that gave me focus. I simply followed that drill, and that enabled me to focus on what I was doing and to ultimately to try to keep it together in the air, if you understand. So I followed the drill, followed the protocol to the letter of what I'd been taught, simply followed the dashboard from left to right, everything off in sequence. And then, as quite low now, a couple of 100 feet, I'm still watching altimeter spin down, but more importantly, I'm looking ahead, looking left, looking right. I knew where I was headed. I was gliding in, and I was following that sort of carefully, that sort of track in the sky. And I was scrubbing off as much airspeed by sort of flaring gently and pushing forward on the stick to then keep the nose kind of on glide. And I scrubbed off as much airspeed as I dare by controlling that movement. But in the meantime, a couple of 100 feet in the air, comms at that stage was futile. So I'd ripped off my headset, threw it in the opposite footwell, just to get the flex lead cable out of the way because I believed it was going to be a hindrance. And I was concerned about that. Also unbuckled my 3-point harness. So the pilot, as you may know, wears a more, if you will, comprehensive harness than a typical kind of passenger in a commercial aircraft. So you just wear it ordinarily around the waist. The pilot will wear a harness over each shoulder and around the waist. So it's a 3-point harness. So I carefully unbuckled that. I wriggled out of that so I was free of the harness. I opened my left-hand canopy door, or at least I went to open it, and it wouldn't open initially. So that caused alarm bells, that caused a bit of panic. And I thought, my God. So I had to actually elbow the door and also punch it, like lean across briefly and strike it with the heel of my hand in order to get that sort of purchase on the door. So the door would then flick up to the vertical position. Luckily, with that action, I was able to pop the door and it flicked up to the vertical position, a bit like a Lamborghini style, the opening of the door. And I'm very low now. I'm sort of 100 feet, sort of 50 feet. I'm looking forwards.
How fast are you going at this point, roughly?
I'm gliding in, and I've got it probably down to literally, in the last moments, about 30 knots. So probably 32, 33 miles per hour. And I'm still gliding in. I'm looking forwards through the front canopy, the windshield. I'm looking left, looking right, looking for hazards, looking for obstacles in the last moments, anything that was going to hinder my approach. And I'm I'm just focused. I'm reasonably confident about what I'm about to do, what I'm about to pull off. But, you still don't know. But I'm doing my level best to kind of hold it together.
So what are you thinking of trying to do?
Literally, I'm coming on. So literally, I am hyperventilating at that stage in a vain bid to protect my airway here from flame ingress. And I've also got one eye shut in an instinctive, if you will, but vain bid to protect my eyes from the now lapping flames against
flames
my
are up here now.
Face and neck.
Wow.
The flames were literally at head and neck height in those last moments. So 50 feet, 40 feet, 30 feet, 20 feet, looking all around, observation through the one eye, because I had to keep one eye open to see where I was going, and hyperventilating to protect my airway. So literally left hand on the control stick, right hand on the throttle. I've knocked off the throttle, and I was literally this position. And then I just, at 20 feet, I've considered this. I was like Jack Rabbit. I was quick as a flash. I was now clambered up onto the seat that I was sat in. I'd made a step over the small door lip between the seat and the left wing, and I'd stepped out onto that wing momentarily, composed myself on the wing, got my balance, snapped my hands above my head in the sort of prayer position, looked directly at the horizon in front of me, did not look down, and then I just I jumped off the trailing edge, if you will, took a giant leap from the back of the left wing, running in approximately 30 knots, and I estimated that I left that wing about 15 feet above ground as I was gliding in. And in all sincerity, I got away with that stunt by the skin of my bacon, by the skin of my teeth, like literally. 15 feet above the ground, running in, made that leap. And luckily for me, and I knew this, the ground would afford me some level of compression or absorption because of the recent Florida sort of downfall, if you will.
Yeah.
So I knew that the ground was somewhat softened because of the recent storm front that had passed through, and the sun had come out again during, pre my flight, and starting to obviously, superheat the atmosphere once again. But I knew the ground would still be somewhat soft as a result. And that kind of paid off, if you will. So that was the motive, that was the mindset for doing what I did and jumping at over the grass where I'd sort of glided in towards. But that said, the damage was done. So what had happened was I landed feet first because of the, if you will, the kind of prowess and the ability to be able to make that jump and jump relatively clean. And what was useful for me was the fact that I was a very highly trained paratrooper with the British Army and Special Forces in particular. In truth, I only got away with that by the skin of my teeth. So I landed feet first, and what was useful to me was the fact that I was, up until that point, a highly trained paratrooper. I'd done a lot of work with parachuting around the world, specifically with the Army and with UK Special Forces. So I kind of knew how to jump clean, if you will, from a moving aircraft, from a sort of a moving sort of object in the sky. And if you will, that's where the confidence to make that jump came from. But that said, the damage was done. So I was a life-changing injury in the moments leading up to that from the burn. But ultimately what happened. I made the jump. I landed feet first. I landed like a sack of spuds because literally when I landed feet first, my body sort of piled in.
Buckled, yeah.
I had a secondary impact. So yeah, the body just buckled underneath me. Secondary impact, face versus, albeit soft ground.
Yeah.
But it still caused
impact, yeah.
Massive impact. It caused bilateral nasal fracture, supraorbital eye socket fractures above both eyes, multiple soft tissue lacerations from the sharp Florida razor grass. In the kinetic force coming through the body, through the gut and torso region, inadvertently caused me to rupture my colon, my large intestine, and also lacerate one flank or one side of my liver, which was now internally hemorrhaging and bleeding profusely internally. I mean, I was in a bad way. So not only am I losing sort of blood volume within my gut sort of region, within the torso, but I've got the multiple facial fractures. I've also hyperextended this index finger and this digit on impact awkwardly, and that's fractured. My collarbone, a couple of ribs, the internal injuries that I've described, the multiple facial fractures and the soft tissue laceration. But the worst of it was, for the record, I was 63% third and fourth degree burns.
Wow.
And that was over total body surface area, if you can picture that.
So to explain what third and fourth degree burns are to people that don't know.
It's to do with the layering of the skin. So our skin has multiple layers when you look at it in the sort of biological cellular sense. So the outer layer of the skin is called epidermis. I've learnt about this because I've learnt a lot. And also, ironically, I was a very highly trained sort of patrol medic as part of my role with the UK Special Forces as well back in the day. So I understood what I was up against, and I learnt more about this coming through the grind, if you will, as a burns victim for so long in the hospital. But in the layers, you've got epidermis on the external layer. So in other words, if you get a little graze or a scratch, that could damage the epidermis. If you perhaps, you're jogging down the footpath and you take a nasty fall and you scrape the skin a bit deeper and it's a bit of a nasty gash, that's probably first and second degree in terms of damage to your skin, because you're talking epidermis and dermis layer.
Okay.
And it can perhaps affect the blood vessels, particularly capillaries, and that can cause more bleed. Third degree, however, is when you lose deeper substrate and particularly fatty tissue, which is deeper set behind those first two layers, and they call that epithelial tissue, or the more sort of fatty substrate. But when you talk about fourth degree, which is actually much more serious, it can be down to the bone. You're talking about burns where you can be left with exposed bone.
Wow.
Like literally. So for all intents and purposes, the victim has visible sort of ivory showing, if you catch my drift.
So you were 63% burned third and fourth. And what parts of your body
down
were
to
best?
The fourth, so right of shoulder.
Yeah.
Was so badly burned because obviously when I got on that wing, I got the backwash of the prop and it fanned me all the way down the right-hand side of the body, because I turned to the left, and momentarily I stood and composed myself and balanced on the left wing before I took the giant leap from the trailing edge of the back of the left wing. So I got fanned with the backwash of the prop where it was still winding down.
Blimey. And
that literally burned through the aggressive, like giant blowtorch, if you will, burned through my thin cotton t-shirt on the shoulder. That was down to the bone.
Quick word from one of our sponsors, Guru Technology. Simply put, they're the highest Google-rated company in their industry. A very different service and a very different set of products covering business-to-business mobiles, phone systems, energy, renewables and EV, security, CCTV, alarms, AMPR, broadband and IT. They specialise in dealing with companies who are receiving really poor service and spending a lot of money currently with their supplier. They will come to site, do a free of charge audit and fix any problems that you're having. So if you've got problems with your current supply chain, search Guru Technology in Google and give them a buzz. Thank you. Let's get back to the podcast.
Wow. On the shoulder. But worse for me was my shin area. Remember, that's where the fire initially breached the cockpit.
Yeah.
And the shin area bore the brunt of the initial exposure of the flames building up. And so the burn was longer in that period of the body.
Yeah.
And I was literally burned down to the shin on both lower limbs, which was hence the fourth degree burns down there. I was extremely lucky, in all sincerity, that my body was able to tolerate that gravitas of injury. Looking back, who was I? I was as fit as a butcher's dog. I was a highly trained paratrooper at the time, and a very highly motivated soldier, doing what I was doing in my role. And it's not so much of a boast, but what that gave me ultimately was that ability to fight. If I didn't have that level of fitness and physical conditioning, in other words, there's no way that I would have been able to keep up the if you will, that early fight, against the trauma that I faced on that moment, on that day. So back again, 19th of August 2007. If I'd have been, even the doctors said it to me some months later on. They said if you'd have been just a normal, average person, there's no way you would have been able to keep to fight against that trauma and tolerate it. We've seen much lesser burns that have fallen by the wayside because they didn't have perhaps the physical conditioning to be able to hold on. So it was a monumental scrap for me to be able to tolerate that, and I mean, clearly the medics did pick me up. So ambulance at the scene.
Do you remember at this point?
Everything on the day, on the day that happened. Literally, I remember up until the moment they put me down.
Yeah.
In the hospital, literally.
You were put into a coma for
6 months.
For 6 months.
So I remember initially, as you asked, having made the jump, and then crawled away some distance away from the scene, but not until I'd rolled around back and forward to sort of smother the flames. I had to pat out my right shoulder, pat out my scalp, wow, which was burning ferociously, a bit like a Roman candle at both points, here and here. And then I physically remembered the aircraft still airborne, still kind of on that trajectory towards the earth. I quickly turned, looked through the hands, or the slats of my fingers, so to speak, and in doing so, I caught glimpse, my sort of eyes literally caught focus on the aircraft still in the air. So she was literally, to give you an indication, she was sort of nose heavy and left wing down in the distance, and I was looking towards it. And at that stage, the propeller was probably only the height of an average man, say 6 feet maximum above the ground. And I physically caught glimpse and then watched my own aircraft almost like slow motion. She just headed towards the earth at that point, crashing, crumpling noise, ugly noise as she piled in. And it was a tremendous noise, almost deafening. And then there was a momentary pause of some maybe 8 to 10 seconds, or at least that's what it felt like. Yeah. This horrible sort of pregnant pause, and then all of a sudden, boom! It was almighty explosion, and I was literally. It felt like I was on top of that. But fortunately, at that point, I estimate I was about 70 feet away. So perhaps the length of a couple of double-decker buses. Yeah. Not far, but far enough to be outside of the fire radius of the explosion, but not, might I add, not outside the radius of the shockwave. So I can remember that shockwave that you get from an explosion coming through me, sort of reverberating through me and back again. And it was hideous. It sucked out all of the air within my lung. And I can tell you that I couldn't breathe. I mean, I was like, I just felt like all the air, because that's what explosions do. It's like they cause a vacuum. Yeah. And they literally zap all the oxygen and air within the atmosphere. And you just can't, there's nothing to breathe within, the vacuum's just been gone within that local airspace. So for split moments, I just couldn't breathe. I couldn't get my breath until that kind of went out and back again. And then it was all of a sudden, suddenly I could breathe again. It was like my lungs would inflate again. And of course, I was desperate to catch my breath. With everything that had just transpired and all of those physical movements, I was desperately trying to catch up with the breath anyway and make that sort of early recovery in the sort of, if you will, in the sort of cardiovascular sense. The heart and lungs were trying to play catch up. So I remember that. I remember the shockwave and how that affected me. Couldn't catch my breath. Then suddenly I could catch my breath, and it was hideous. It was a frightful, desperate moment. And then instinctively, that's the only way I look at it, instinctively I then tried to crawl away in the long grass, because the instinct was just to get the hell away and make more distance between myself and the burning wreckage. I just had to get further away. So I did. I tried to desperately crawl through the long grass, sort of leopard crawl style. We'd call that in the army, sort of leopard crawl through the long grass, sort of almost hands and knees. In doing so, I probably estimate that I got 10, 15 feet further distance between myself and the wreckage. Yeah. And that was just an instinctive, just get away. Yeah. But in doing so, I caused more trauma. So I remember lacerating my face in the long grass even further, cheeks, forehead, scalp. elbows.
Is that because the skin was melted to such a degree it was just falling
Possibly,
off?
but also undoubtedly. But I would suggest, moreover, because the grass in Florida is like razor.
Right.
It's like the tropical grass. It's not like fine grass like you get here in like England, Scotland, Ireland.
Yeah.
Which is fine, almost soft grass.
Yeah.
You sit in the back garden and you rub your hands through it. It's lovely here. In Florida, it's a different sort of ballpark.
Yeah.
It's coarse, it's sharp, and I'm leopard crawling 10, 15 feet aggressively on adrenaline to just get away. I've got about 15 feet. I'm trying to catch my breath further. I'm utterly spent.
You must be in excruciating pain at this point.
It's starting to hit me, and suddenly I realise, my God, my face. I could feel almost the kind of the moisture, the trickle down my face, like blood running, my elbows and my kneecaps, because I've just torn up my elbows and knees in those long, sharp grass further. I've caused even more trauma, even more insult, and then at that stage, I'm done. I mean, given the early fight, yes, and being, that highly trained sort of, super fit soldier. I mean, I probably had the fitness at that stage, or up until that point, of a Premiership League footballer. I was in great shape. I really was in top shape. I was, a badged, SF guy in it up until that moment.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I had tremendous kind of response to do everything that I did and to get away. But by that stage, I was hugely traumatized with everything that I'd mentioned. I was spent. I was nothing left. I got up on my knees. I remember this much. Got up on my knees in the soft in that long grass, but albeit softer ground. And then I sort of looked back, hands above my face to protect, but to still kind of look through and, if you will, survey the wreckage in the distance. And it was hideous. Yes, the explosion had died down, but it was still burning away ferociously, the wreckage, from what I could see. And there wasn't much of what was left. It was just the explosion had ripped the aircraft to pieces, and from what I could see, I could just make out like a sort of a blob of sort of wreckage, and the fire was an intense inferno, probably some 85 feet away from where I, if you will, stood on my knees. Yeah. And I was done. I couldn't go any further, and then there was three things that happened psychologically, which I like to mention. So, the first reaction that kind of upwelled within me was absolute off the charts anger. I mean, I was so angry at what had just happened. I was like cursing the gods. Everything was coming out. All that angry emotion was driving out of me at a rate of knots, and I couldn't control that. I mean, I describe, I could have taken on 10 men. Yeah. If 10 men were stood in front of me, I'd have been like the Incredible Hulk, just like throwing them off. That was the anger that was in me, sort of psychologically speaking.
Why do you think that was?
Because of Jesus, because of what had just happened. Because I knew that I was like seriously traumatized, because I was mullered, for want of a better word. Yeah. And I had nothing left to give. And I knew that what that injury had just taken from me. As far as I was concerned, I was burned from head to toe, and I was going blind because of the reaction to the flames, and part of my cornea on both eyes had taken a degree of the burn from the flame. So I'm now starting to go blind with the reaction, and the face was swelling badly. The pain had washed over me just after getting up on my knees to survey that wreckage, and it had washed over me like a giant tsunami, and the pain was indescribable from head to toe. And so I was angry because I knew my life was screwed, right, for want of a better description, and I knew that my life was never going to be the same again. And I knew that I'd gone from being that all singing, all dancing soldier on top of the world, literally everything to play for, a young guy, not a bad looking bloke as well. And I knew that I'd had burns from head to toe virtually that clearly would have caused massive disfigurement and change. That much was obvious to me, given what had just happened. And again, the pain, face, neck, scalp, all my body was hideous. So it was obvious to me that the burns would have caused dramatic change. And also, again, I will mention it again, the irony of this was I was also don't forget a highly trained medic. The equivalent of a sort of a roadside paramedic.
So you
so
know
I knew the medical side of it, and I knew what had just happened, and I knew that it was obvious to me that it was severe, extenuating third-degree burns. That was hence the anger. I knew what I was up against. I knew the change, and in all sincerity, I didn't think that I was going to survive.
Yeah.
I thought there's no way that I'm going to survive this. It's just a matter of time. I'm going to ebb away, and I'm going to be lucky if I can hold on for minutes.
So I read somewhere that the doctors gave you sort of 4 or 5% chance of survival.
They literally gave me 5% probability of survival based on official injury assessment and, if you will, that prognosis from what they diagnosed, having reviewed me in Florida. So what happened was I got an ambulance on scene within about 15 minutes. In the meantime, I'd taken off my shoes and socks, laid them by my side because I figured, well, this is one journey I'm not going to need shoes and socks for. I'm about to check out because I could feel myself ebbing away. The fluids leaving my body, literally the heat energy leaving my body, and I'm getting colder, I'm getting weaker, I'm hyperventilating with the shock now, and I'm becoming hypothermic. So I'm becoming very cold, very shivery, despite the fact that I'm lying there under the hot Florida sun at approximately 12-13 hours, just after midday. But still, I'm getting very cold, I'm getting weaker, and I'm dying. I'm a man on the edge. Like literally life on a thread. And so I'm holding on, and I'm waiting, and I'm holding on with everything that I've got, and I didn't think I was going to be able to hold on. And I'm hyperventilating, and I'm getting colder, and all of a sudden the sirens, I hear them getting louder and louder, that woo, 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 and it's coming for me, and I'm thinking they must be coming for me because this is a sleepy little area. There's not much going on otherwise, and indeed the sirens grew louder and louder. And from my...
Bet that was a long wait.
It seemed like a very long wait, but from my, strong recollection, it was like a full-scale Hollywood response at the scene. I mean, literally, there was fire engines. I could hear the deeper resonance of, like, bigger vehicles and engines, and, like, almost different tones of emergency services vehicles arriving. So some would have been ambulance, police, fire engines. I've even got photographs of the scene as well, because people documented all of that. And so it was a proper, should we say, full-on emergency medical response from the US authorities. They arrived on scene, and then they stretchered me on the back of an ambulance. I could hear the chatter of the emergency radios and the communication that was vaguely going on. I couldn't tell you what was being said, but I could hear the chatter. And they stretchered me. They put me in the back of an ambulance over the rough ground because it was sort of grassy, remember? Onto some hard standing because suddenly it was a lot smoother. They opened the doors to the ambulance. They pulled the stretcher out. They transported that stretcher, boom, onto the back of a waiting helicopter. And then the doors for the helicopter slid shut. And I heard the unmistakable whoop, 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 whoop. And then the oscillating movement side to side that you get under sort of flight of chopper, if you will. And I'm going up into the airspace and I'm being transported away. I knew so much that it was a helicopter because obviously, having been that soldier, I've been in and out of many helicopters. So
can you remember much of that journey?
Yeah, interestingly, I mean, the pain was hideous. They'd already given me a bit of morphine at the scene, so literally in the grass.
Can I ask you something about that specifically? So when you say the pain was hideous, can you try and, for somebody who hasn't had an experience of being burnt to any degree at all, can you try and describe that pain?
I can't. I mean, that pain was, the only thing I can say in retrospective sort of hindsight, looking back, what I do remember is when I received the pain, first of all, the stimuli of pain. Remember, I was on my knees. I desperately tried to sort of process what was going on, and all of a sudden the pain hit me with unimaginable weight. And
is that the adrenaline running out?
Yeah, clearly the adrenaline had obviously dropped off within the body.
Because at that point you've had a cockpit full of flames, and your legs were the worst hit. You said, didn't you? So
the legs and the body
for a while,
to a degree, inside the cockpit. But the worst part of it, I would probably suggest also was when I got onto the wing
Which is
momentarily, and I got the fanning
Yeah.
from the backwash.
Yeah.
So I've got this kind of right side dominant burn. You know, if you look at the right ear,
Yeah.
the surgeons were pretty much compelled to snip off most of the right ear because it was so deeply burned, the tissue there.
Yeah.
And the left side is somewhat more, because that would have been in more the leeward, what we call the windward side.
Yeah.
We've
Yeah.
got it worse, but the leeward side was more protected because
Right.
this was where the air flow came from.
So was this the majority of the pain then?
Yeah, so I've got left ear,
Yeah.
which is pretty good. So this
Yeah.
is what we'd call mechanics of injury.
Yeah.
How it happened more specifically, how it occurred, and I know this from being a medic. You need to understand the mechanics of the injury and how it specifically occurred to have an appreciation of how that body was injured specifically. And so I know that right side dominant was my burn. Yeah, it's still to a left side degree.
Yeah.
But the right side was far more deeply burned. Sorry, and that was what I was up against. And yeah, you asked the question. I mean, the pain was hideous. It was off the charts. It was indescribable. And that's the only way that I can. You know, there is no 1 to 10.
Yeah.
Here. This was just off the charts. It does not get any worse. The pain that I received on that day, that pain in itself was enough to finish a man. It was enough to finish a man at the scene. Like I said, I believe the only reason I was able to tolerate that pain was because I was a highly trained soldier / athlete up until that moment, and that's what gave me that early fight. I mean, the night before, I was out in Florida running a 10-kilometer.
Yeah.
But not just jogging, I was running at pace.
Yeah.
And I was able to do good times because that was who I was. You know, I was an athlete and I was always putting in good times. Why? Because I loved running.
Yeah.
And I was mad into it, and I got a lot out of my running, both physically, psychologically and spiritually. There was something about me and running.
Yeah.
And I'd been a runner for years. And indeed that's, you know, what helped me get through the selection process with Special Forces. You know, I was a strong runner, and I was one of like only probably 5% of candidates that made that on my intake. You know, so I was a really gifted sort of athlete up until that point.
Yeah.
Up until that point, yeah. But then guess what? It took everything from me. It was like the rug got pulled. I was no longer that man. That guy had gone in that moment. In the 45 seconds approximate burn time within the aircraft up until the point when I exited and jumped.
Yeah.
You know, that was probably the duration of trauma, if you will. And like I said, the worst part of it, you know, getting fanned on the wing. But in those moments that I've, you know, described to you, it took everything from me. The rug got pulled. So I was no longer that same gentleman. I was no longer that same athlete. In fact, I would never be him again. You know, the accident took a lot from me and rendered me with physical disability in the aftermath, because surgeons were forced to conduct an awful lot of surgeries, including specifically surgeries to my lower limbs, where I had fasciotomy.
60 plus surgeries.
I've had 63 surgeries.
Wow.
And that's the irony here again.
Wow.
Because I was 63% third and fourth degree burn.
Wow.
And I've actually had 63 surgeries to date under general anaesthetic. So they put me to sleep 63 times. And I'm still under consultants now, but it's a lot easier now. I'm having light laser work now with the Harley Street Skin Clinic.
Yeah.
And that's all done, thankfully, through a small charity called Back on Track. But I'm very lucky. You know, I've come a hell of a long way. That was 15 years ago. And through tremendous medical interventions, as I say, a lot of good doctors and nurses and medical specialists, they helped. But I would argue that a massive part of it was my own doing. I, as an individual, so Jamie Hull version 2.0, absolutely, categorically had to pull my own socks up and metaphorically get on with it. If I didn't help myself in the early stages of the trauma, there's no way that I was coming through that. And to give you that indication, so I was drug induced for 6 months, which you picked up on. I spent a further 1.5 years in hospitals in the UK after America.
Yeah.
They flew me back over. So from Stansted Airport to Chelmsford Central Burns Unit in Essex for a couple of months, then Stoke Mandeville for about 16, 17 months on the big burns unit there.
Yeah.
East Grinstead Hospital for specialist plastic surgery interventions. Cambridge, Addenbrooke's for some more specialist, if you will, sort of maxillofacial sort of work around the nose and mouth. So I had a brilliant surgeon at Cambridge that helped with a lot of that. High Wycombe for bone or orthopaedic work. Salisbury District Hospital,
You've
believe
been
it
everywhere.
or not, I've been everywhere for some big laparotomy intervention. So big cuts down the midline to repair some internal problems that I still had going on.
Yeah.
But long story short, with great intervention from the medical world, both privately in the US, and it's not so much of a boast again, but just to give perhaps your people an understanding, $2.7 million was the medical bill in the US, which gives you an idea of what they had to do for me. Fortunately, it was private, and I had an insurance policy. And I got the very best medical care in the States, probably arguably one of the best hospitals in the world, if not the best burns unit, certainly. And as I was going to say, much of the effort and the emphasis and the work surrounding my recovery and my rehabilitation was down to me. If I didn't make it happen, it wouldn't have happened.
Yeah.
So I had to not be lazy. I had to... When the times were really dark in the hospital, I had to drag my weary butt out of bed, and I had to work, and I had to push the boundaries.
What was your darkest time through your rehab?
Well, undoubtedly it was the early years. So the first 3 years were hell on earth. I can't even describe them to you. The pain, the suffering, the mental anguish, the trauma. There was no light for me. Do you understand what I mean? There was no light in life. There was no joy. It was just hideous. But something in me kept pushing, I guess, in the subconscious, kind of kept up that kind of pretense, kept up that fight. And I almost lost the will after about a year and a half. I almost threw the towel in.
So, did you ever have... Obviously, you mentioned about the pain being off the charts with your injuries. Did you ever have a period of time where you had such a dark moment during your rehab that you thought, "Do you know what, I wished I hadn't have survived"?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I got to about the 18-month marker, which is surprising that I managed to go that long, not just in the physiological fight sense, but also in the sort of cognitive, psychological fight sense, because so much of it was mental and psychological. And so I got to 18 months having been in the fight, and I describe this as being like a boxer in the ring. It's at least what it felt like, but I wasn't on round 12, say, gone the distance in the fight, taking the punches and taking the blows. I was on round like 4,137 or something. It was ridiculous. I'd been fighting that long, so 1.5 years on the timeline post-injury, and I just thought, this is a joke. I'm still in terrible physiological condition. I was in the hospital. I was not really getting there. That's what it felt like. And the reason being is because my body was in such a bad state, and I was looking at my right shoulder. It still looked like a raw lamb chop. And I was looking at aspects of my body, on my torso, my back. It was all open, and I still hadn't healed. 1.5 years on, I still hadn't healed.
Wow. And
so this was why my morale seriously started to dip and slide off, and I just didn't think I'd be able to keep up the fight any longer living in the hospital. Remember, I'd been in hospital 1.5 years, living in the burns units all over, and it was a joke. So I just figured, look, why fight? Why keep fighting? The quality of life that I've got is like nil. My chin was on the floor. It was rock bottom. So I figured it was probably good for me to think about checking out now.
Did you ever try and take your own life?
I didn't try, because I wasn't going to be doing something messy, sloppy. It just wasn't my style. So I wasn't going to... I considered all of the above options, kind of, some dodgy firearm off the black market. I mean, God knows I knew how to, work my way around most firearms. I'd have been quite happy to do the business perhaps if I'd have had one. But I wasn't going to just try and acquire one or buy one off the black market. It was too messy. It was too sloppy. I owed it to my family not to kind of go down that route. I considered, various options, some sort of prescription medication and a bottle of whiskey per se. And without going into the dark side of all the different options on the table, yeah, I considered a lot of options. But like I said, I didn't want to do it in some sort of sloppy interventional sense. But what I did think in sincerity was a cleaner, more dignified approach with that organisation in Switzerland. And obviously euthanasia is not something that's legal in the UK, and it's not something that's condoned. But there was an option for me potentially with the offerings in Switzerland, and I started a communicative sort of dialogue with them. And luckily, it's not an overnight process, and eventually I did manage to turn a corner.
What do you think that was down to?
Well, I had some visits and some communication interventions, if you will, with a gentleman pastor from the church. So he was an African gentleman from a parish, I believe it was, down in sort of deepest Africa. I think he was from Zimbabwe somewhere. But he was on some kind of secondment to a group or a parish in sort of over Oxford way.
Yeah.
And he was living over there. He was working over there as part of this kind of work phase. And some people had got word to him somehow through the hospital. And he'd agreed to come and have a conversation and see me. And I didn't even really know this was happening other than quite late on. Again, 1.5 years post-injury, and I'm in the hospital. The nurses came in and said, there's a gentleman that wants to come and speak to you. It's kind of, we've sort of arranged it. We thought you might really be interested. And trust me, I was in a dark place. I mean, I wasn't entertaining anyone at that stage. But they said, look, he wants to come and talk. And it's up to you, take it or leave it. But he's just an external, gentleman from the church. Are you interested? And I just figured, what the hell? I've got nothing to lose. And I was more or less just agreeing for agreeing's sake. Yeah. I had nothing better going on. So this chap sort of rocked up in the hospital, and we had sort of some fairly adult conversation, shall we say. Just information was passed back and forward. What I liked about him in a way was that, and I think this was the key, that initially I did actually quite like him. He was a likeable character. Yeah. And his nature wasn't sort of pushy or in any way sort of assertive with the conversation, with the dialogue. He was just relaxed. And I guess that invoked the trust that I may have developed towards him. And I think that, because I quite liked the chap, I thought, okay, you can come back next week. Because believe me, if I didn't like him, I would have just said, and he would have said something about, I'll see you next week. I'd have said, don't bother, mate. I was like, I'm not interested. Like, see ya, kind of thing. Because I was quite blunt with a lot of people, and I was probably not a most pleasant character to be around. Yeah. Because of the kind of state of mind that I was in. And unfortunately, this is what can happen. You end up taking it out on your nearest and dearest, and a lot of people that might try and sort of muscle their way in, and I just ended up, a different bloke for a period. Yeah. But I did actually, for want of a better term, I did sort of entertain this gentleman, Pastor Billy, his name was, and he kept coming sort of week after week and talking to me. And we had some pretty reasonable conversations, they were kind of on the level. And he made me a bit of an ultimatum and said, look, I get it, mate. I really understand where you're at, like not just the body, the mind, and where you're at and what's going on. I totally understand. He said, look, I will help you and I will support you on this and get you where you need to be. And when he sort of offered me that, my sort of ears kind of pricked up. Yeah. And I figured, okay, well, for real, you'll help me. And I was taken aback. And he was the first kind of person, the first individual that had offered to help to get me where I wanted to be. Yeah. And I've already alluded to that. But then he said to me, look, but I want you to do something for me first. And I'm like, well, what can I possibly do for you? He said, I want you to hold on. I want you to hold on just for 1 calendar month. That's all I ask. And it was a hell of an ultimatum for me. And I was really, almost angered by that initially. Because I'm like, well, how dare you? Who are you to kind of offer me this kind of ultimatum, given where I'm at and what's going on? And he said, I'm really sorry, but take it or leave it. That's my offer to you. He said, if you can hold on for 1 calendar month, I will help you. I'll still be there for you. And physically, I'll help you out. And I'll basically offer to drive you to where you need to be.
Yeah.
So I
That was
held
the
on,
big changer.
reluctantly, should we say, reticently, and I'm not sure how the hell I did it, and also about a week later, I ended up having a conversation with my consultant at the time, the burns consultant, who was an Indian gentleman, and he came in and he was kind of happy, he was kind of wagging his tail, and he was saying, look, we've got a new fresh kind of order of skin coming in. They kind of harvest it, and it comes from wherever, other hospitals, accident victims, or perhaps people that have had surgery, whatever. The skin was coming, and he was kind of excited about this. He said, it's a good amount of skin that I've ordered from such and such location. And it's unbelievable what goes on, isn't it? You know, hospitals trading skin.
Yeah, it's crazy.
For patients.
Yeah.
And he said, I've got this skin coming in, it's pretty much got your name on it, and I propose to do this skin graft surgery. And even though skin comes from some other individual, sort of cadaver, so to speak, it gives you a temporary cover.
Yeah.
And that's what the operation and the surgeries are all about, because that allows your own skin cells hopefully to start to heal and knit together underneath that.
Right. Okay.
For a short period of time, until your body basically rejects that short-term
skin. Yeah.
interventional skin. So this was what was going down like the following week. Consultant telling me what was going on, and I agreed to it, albeit, yeah, whatever, because I'd been through so many procedures before.
Yeah.
So the following week, you know, they put me under again with the anaesthetist, put me to sleep, have the surgery, have the operation, wake up. And I remember waking up in the recovery room feeling somewhat stronger, feeling in not quite so much pain, at least, because I was used to waking up in total bloody agony from most of the pre-surgeries that I'd had, from the skin grafts or the various procedures that I'd had. And I'd had, believe me, human donor skin, pig skin, synthetic skin. I'd had it all. But most of the time I'd wake up in that recovery room in clip. I mean, I was in agony. And on this particular occasion, I woke up thinking, it's not as painful somehow. You know, it's still pain, you know, because I've just had a procedure and they'd been scrubbing my back in places to kind of clean up the wounds and the new skin, right? But it felt better. I felt stronger, like the integrity of the back, the shoulder, the scalp, all these open areas that I had going on. And something in my mind with the sort of if you like, the sort of psychological, physical relationship that we have, something in my brain was telling me, this isn't as bad suddenly.
Yeah.
And like, I'm slightly in a better place. I'm slightly
bit of
more
a light.
comfort.
Yeah.
So there was something about that I kind of grasped onto, and indeed about 5 days later, what the nurses do is they take down your dressing. So I looked like a mummy, right? I'd been dressed up post-surgery in the recovery room, and they take down the head dressings, the shoulder dressings, the back dressings. They take it all down, and they look at you in the noddy, they look at you in the flesh, and they're like, my God, Jamie, and I remember this really clearly. They said, wow, this is amazing. You look like you're starting to really turn a corner, and you're starting to heal. Like, in other words, the wounds are closing in.
Wow.
Those wounded areas were closing in. And I guess you could say that was all the hope that I needed, something to hold on to.
Yeah.
The first time is like what felt like forever.
Some progress.
Progress. And suddenly I was fed some hope. And that was what I was able to feed off.
Yeah.
And then, if you will, I was still in the dark tunnel, and I was moving towards now the light that I could see at the end of the tunnel, and I was burrowing towards that.
Yeah.
It wasn't overnight, and I kept crawling towards that, and eventually managed to sort of pull myself the hell out of there, and sort of suddenly, you know, there was light again, and I was back in the real world. But I had a long way to go.
No, absolutely, and I think you've come a long way from that point.
Tremendous.
We've spoken, you know, off of here and during as well. Talk to everybody about some of the things that you're doing now. So, you know, obviously you've got your book that's out, that's been out for about a year, Life on a Thread. You're doing different motivational topics, speeches with different people.
Yeah.
Talk to us all about sort of what your life's like now.
I mean, in essence, just quickly in the comeback, so post-hospital, I was able to eventually learn to walk, to feed, to write. My hands were crippled, but kind of get back into the semblance of some sort of active health, some sort of normality. And I did a lot of challenges. I was fortunate through charities like Help for Heroes, Blesma, which is British Limbless Ex-Servicemen's Association, that supported me. I was able to do like marathon challenges. I did London Marathon, New York Marathon, London. I kept pushing. I kept testing myself, and I kind of got stronger, got fitter over the course of time. That was the first thing. Realising that I wasn't the same athlete, I've already mentioned that.
Yeah.
The toolbox wasn't quite the same. It was a more slimmed down version of me, you know, Jamie in the version 2.0. But realising what my newfound but albeit limited potential was compared to old,
Yeah.
in comparison, and realising the new me, I was able to develop more hope, more confidence, and gradually figure out the things that I could do. So I went on to become, in the professional world, I became an ML, which is a mountain leader, sort of guide in the mountains. And I did a lot of professional work. I led a lot of expeditions around the world for like young teams, from places like Vietnam and Laos to, you know, Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, even Ecuador and Galapagos. So I did all this kind of like weird and wonderful work as an ML. And then I was interested in the diving world. I'd always been an instructor from old. I went back into that. I was leading a lot of wounded expeditions for, as we say, for veterans, other vets that had been injured perhaps in the war in Afghan or Iraq. And I was able to inspire myself by a lot of these individuals that I was leading and teaching and guiding. That gave me more inspiration and more kind of kudos, for want of a better description, and with that more hope about myself and more realization about what I was capable of.
I suppose those experiences and sort of sucking all that up and soaking it all up are adding to that hope.
Yeah, I did a lot of expeds with these guys and going to places like the Red Sea in Egypt, and I even took a couple of private clients to the Maldives, to Truk Lagoon in Micronesia. So I got to dive some real hot spots around the world. But moreover, I was interested in developing myself as an instructor. So I went on to become kind of more senior as an instructor with the British Sub-Aqua Club and PADI. And then in recent years, I became a PADI instructor in the dive industry.
Yeah.
Which is effectively a more senior lead. So I'm able to work at a higher level, and that was not just inspirational for me, but it was I was able to network in a stronger sense. And a recent example utilising that was that I led an exped for a very wounded gentleman to the Bahamas. I was able to network and kind of push some buttons because of my status within the industry. And I met some people that were able to support me for the sake of this very wounded soldier from Doncaster. So it's a gentleman called Ben Parkinson, MBE, that got blown up in Afghanistan, lost both of his legs above the knee, and sustained a traumatic brain injury. So Ben and I would work together, and we did a lot of diving out in the Bahamas, including some quite hairy dives with some big sharks. So I've had a wonderful experience. I did race across America as another challenge with Help for Heroes.
Wow, yeah.
Rode a push bike 3,100 miles as part of an 8-man team of wounded veterans. So also with an 18-man support crew, we were able to get across America in 7 days and 7 hours. And again, this is not so much of a boast, this is what I did. But it's more about the power of what can be achieved, because we were a bunch of wounded guys, but with the right level of support, and obviously that took a bit of funding from the charity to pull it off. So you might wonder where some of the money goes. I'm not saying it all goes on fancy expeditions for the wounded, but that gave all of us tremendous confidence in our recovery journeys going forward as individual servicemen. And it was just a little example of some of the really privileged kind of projects that I was a part of, but supported me and supported us as a team and the guys. And I got a tremendous amount out of that. I learnt a lot about myself and other things, like I went and climbed mountains around the world, and slow time, because I was disabled, remember, and I'm not the same athlete, I'm not the same high-speed soldier. So yeah, I might have been SAS back in the day, but now I'm just slow and steady. That's the sort of the joke of it for me.
Yeah.
But slow time, I was able to climb Kilimanjaro. So with a guide by my side, I was literally leaning on this gentleman, like coming all the way back down the mountain, because I'm not so good descending on the steep terrain because of the loss of muscle in my shins.
Yeah.
So again, another example of how you can still do things with the right level of support. So what I say to people is, look, this is my story. This is my testimony. Many people have got stories, but what I can share with you is, look, irrespective of that monumental change in me from being that kind of quarterback sort of athlete that I was, back in the day, like all singing, all dancing, to having that monumental change and the rug being pulled, and I end up being version 2.0, effectively with disability, harbouring and carrying disability for life. But with the right will and determination, I was still able to go on and challenge myself in all sorts of weird and wonderful and extraordinary ways. And I'd like to think that that is what gives hope to other people. That they see me as being, all right, a guy that was, but a guy that still can do, with the right attitude and with the right mindset. And that's my take on it, and that's what I like to share with others.
If you could choose to carry on being Jamie 0.20, yeah?
You sure? The new guy, yeah?
New guy,
yeah.
Or Jamie of old, prior to accident, which Jamie would you pick?
It's a tough one. I mean, don't get me wrong. I mean, if I could go back and maybe, if there was a magic wand, so to speak, or the genie with a lamp, I don't know. I mean, don't get me wrong. I really super enjoy my life now, and I've made it work to the best that I possibly can.
Yeah.
But I'm often curious as to what journey I may have taken beforehand, and I may have been that curious that if there was a genie with a lamp, so to speak, I'd go back.
Yeah.
Not to say that I'm unhappy with where I'm at. I am happy.
Yeah.
And I've rebuilt my life, and I've kind of found, tremendous focus, and I've got a lot of extraordinary things going on, like multiple plates that I'm sort of spinning in life, things that give me a lot of joy and satisfaction. And I've kind of made that happen with a lot of support and interventions along the way. And it's the will and determination that's got me there. But realistically, if there was magic, I'd go back. But of course, there is no magic. That's the key thing here.
Yeah.
You cannot change history. Nobody can. We cannot go back. So, you've just got to bloody well make the most of what, the blessings that we're given. And I guess there's an old saying, you've got to learn to be grateful for small mercies. And if there's one thing that I've learned, and believe me, that did not happen overnight. I mean, 3 years of physical healing, but I would suggest 5 years of mental kind of cognitive acceptance, in my case, accepting the change of physiological body to a degree, accepting the change of physical appearance to a degree, and the fact that the rug got pulled and I could no longer be that same guy and do those same things that I was doing before. But by accepting is what drives us forward as human beings. And listen, I'm not unique in the world. Other people face trauma. Other people face change. In the trivial sense, it might be an injury. It might be an illness. It might be a diagnosis that you receive.
Yeah.
But if you can fight through with that will, with that determination, and sometimes it takes the extraordinary courage to dig that little bit deeper to fight through whatever's going on in your life as an individual. But if you can fight through and if you can accept change, then fundamentally I think that's what segregates us as being something quite extraordinary, something quite special as a species. I'm talking about the human spirit and the human species. That's what separates. It's something that animals can't do. An animal gets a grave injury, chances are that animal's going to perish. And if the animal, may not perish, comfortably, then obviously a veterinary surgeon will assist. That kind of stuff goes on. But there's a reason why human beings are given sometimes the interventions and the necessary support to come through and to fight through. There's perhaps a reason why we're given that support, and that's because simply the human spirit potentially can have the effect to allow us to take the onus of responsibility for our own journeys, put that effort in, and fight through. we can't always rely on the interventions, like I mentioned, medical interventions, but we have the spirit and we have the ability to fight through. It's up to us. The question is, how hungry are you for the process? That is the fundamental question. But if you've got that hunger and that will, then things are possible. And that's what I say to a lot of people. You just have to want it.
And that definitely comes across in speaking to you. You know, that fire in the belly, that definitely comes across.
I almost lost it
along your journey.
So that is part of my testimony as well, that I understand how the human spirit can subside and how it can fall by the wayside, and how as an individual you could give up. I get that. I get people's journeys and I get what's going on. I have a real appreciation for that now. But what I will say is, if as an individual, if as a human being you are hungry enough and you have that will to fight, you can surprise yourself. I mean, even pre-injury, I guess looking back when I did the selection process for, a couple of things. I did selection process for parachute regiment with something called P Company. It was a hideous, training program, and it was a hideous selection process that I went through. And then obviously the test week, and then going on and doing, the similar kind of processes for selection for SF. And I mentioned only a small percentage of people will come through that. But if you have the ability to hold on, if you have the ability to dig deep and to keep fighting and to stay hungry for a process, believe me, you might just surprise yourself and you might just come through that process. And these are the things that I've learned in all of my kind of journey in life. And hopefully if I can pass that on, then it can help a few souls out there.
I think it will absolutely help a few souls, more than that, I think, Jamie. So really appreciate those comments. So what's next for you?
For me, what's to come? So I like to hopefully be a spokesperson, hopefully be a voice for the greater good. And that's not trying to put myself onto some sort of dramatic pedestal, or I'm not the Messiah. I'm just another human being that's had a journey and come through. But I continue to do some of my speaking work professionally, and I do a lot of corporate work now. I mean, I'm based in London, so there's a lot of stuff that goes on. In fact, I'm speaking to London Fire Brigade very shortly, and just recently I've spoken to Meta, which is obviously Facebook, and other big sort of corporate clients that I've spoken to in recent times, from pharmaceutical companies to defence contractors and companies to construction companies. So all that kind of work continues. Obviously, I was lucky to get published with Penguin. My story is Life on a Thread. It's widely available on all platforms, including Amazon, and that's been selling very well. I've sold sort of thousands of copies around the world, and the story is, fortunately, it's starting to sort of take momentum, and I guess word of mouth as well. So I continue to do some of my speaking work, some other media work in addition. And also I do a little bit of expedition work on the side. So I mentioned the fact that I'm sort of qualified as ML, or indeed sort of PADI course director. So I do some private work or work with groups and clubs and societies and all the rest of it, and indeed some other work with sort of veterans on a sort of a more bespoke basis. So altogether I spin a few plates.
Well, it sounds like a very varied and inspirational lifestyle that you're living, and making the best of the situation that you're in, and passing on really important messages to people that people need to hear.
Yeah, thank you. And then one last thing is, I've also learnt to make a little bit of time for me. That's important, and I think everybody should try to. So I try to nurture me as an individual, as a character, look after myself. So I'm now sort of into my sort of mid-40s, but I try to, nurture myself with good diet, regular exercise, comfortable sort of regular sort of sleeping pattern. I try not to party too much. It's not to say that I'm against all that, but I realise that the main thing is that I nurture my health. So I'm regular walking and hiking, and I do a lot of swimming as well. I love swimming. I love to get some pool time in, and get a few laps done. And I'm diving when I can, and perhaps riding a push bike if the weather's decent. So it's important to stay active.
Variety.
And that's a message to others as well, because if you nurture all of that, then I think you can be the best version of yourself.
And I think, going back to what we first spoke about, that best version of yourself has given us the ability to have this conversation. Because if you weren't the best version of yourself physically and mentally, in your own words, you wouldn't be here right now.
For sure. And I mean, looking back, there was a time when I wasn't confident. There was a time that there was no way that I'd be wanting to sort of entertain anybody, let alone sort of give a comprehensive account of my journey. You know, it was just, I wouldn't want to share that, you know.
Yeah.
So you need to be in the right place.
But it shows that you've got that strength, though, doesn't it? Absolutely does. And if people want to reach out to you, Jamie, and find out a bit more, you obviously mentioned about your book, Life on a Thread, available on Amazon, so we'll make sure that we tag the link into that when we go and put the podcast out for you. Where can people find you if they want to reach out and have a conversation?
So I've got a website which is simply jamiehull.co.uk. Also, you can find me on social media channels. So I'm on Amazon, I beg your pardon, I'm on Instagram and Facebook with verified accounts. So you just have to search for me on there. So it's either Jamie Hull for the page or I am Jamie Hull 1. So blue tick sort of verified accounts on the social media platforms.
Yeah.
Also on LinkedIn as well. So yeah, there's various ways and means. I mean, it's not difficult in this day and age. You've only got to Google someone's name, right?
And you've got it, yeah. Well, when the podcast goes out, I think there's some really, really important messages for the audience. Loads of takeaways that I've had personally, and I know other people are going to have. I'm really, really excited about getting this out. And what we'll do is we'll make sure we tag your social media platforms, just so if somebody wants to reach out, we're making it as easy as possible to get in touch.
Sure. And just very quickly, if people are interested in the wider sort of narrative of my entire story, Life on a Thread, it is available not just in paperback, but also in the ebook, if they prefer that version, or indeed audiobook, they can listen. And I recorded that myself not so long ago in a studio in London. So Brilliant. they might be interested in 11 hours of my sort of dulcet tones.
Oh, mate, no, it's definitely going to be something that I'm going to tune into as well. I've got an Audible account. I listen to a lot of podcasts and a lot of audiobooks, so it's definitely going to be on the list. So thanks very much for coming in, Jamie. I really appreciate it.
No worries, Aaron. Pleasure. Thank you.